Good morning, Buongiorno.
Giorno. There
How are
he
you?
is. Well, doing well. How are you?
I am doing well. Doing well. Yeah. So
Good.
things seem to be okay here.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got the Facebook thing to work.
I got the Facebook thing to work now.
How did that
I don't
happen?
know how long it'll last, but
I don't know. They have changes every day, I suppose, so that one day it doesn't work and the next day it does, and it's quite surprising, really.
right. Yeah.
Must be a
Yeah.
whole team of gnomes working away there and making our technology
Right.
function.
That's exactly it. As long as we keep them happy,
Ah,
we'll be
right.
all right. Thankfully, it's down into the upper 80s now. Here, we've broken our heat wave, at least for a couple
Oh,
of
good.
days with a massive thunderstorm that rolled in last night. So it's actually tolerable to be awake this time of day. But,
Oh, God. Yeah, good.
the joys of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, we've had a very strange summer because we've gone from almost 100-degree days down to 65-degree days.
Wow.
And it's a back and forth thing. And right now it's about, I don't know, 76, 77 degrees. So pretty balmy, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, similar
That's nice.
business in those odd years. I don't get terribly disturbed by it anymore. A lot of people get all anxious because they think, oh, the world's heating up, or the world's cooling down, or the world's doing this and the world's doing that. And I don't know. I think I have a longer vision of history.
It helps.
But it helps. Listening to guys like Graham Hancock, for instance, he's phenomenal in what he suggests about the history of the Earth. And one of the things he suggests is this Earth has seen some pretty cataclysmic weather changes, and so this is like a drop in the bucket. Nothing.
Yeah.
Which gives me great hope. I think that for me, that's one of the advantages of history in general, is when you look back at things in history, God, that really sucked, and it kind of puts our current state of worry into perspective.
I mean, it's not like we've got some Icelandic volcano going off, plunging the whole up northern hemisphere into 3 years of winter without sun. We're doing all right, all told.
We're doing okay. It's considering. Yeah, you listen to like Randall Carlson talking about these massive waves that swept across the continent of North America and killed all the animals. And this is, back at the end of the last ice age or whatever. And you think, well, at least it's not that. I'm not facing this 2-mile-high wave of water coming at me. That's good. Life is good.
Life is good.
Or Black Death, right?
Right. No Black Death. Good.
Or all those things that horrendously used to destroy everybody. So yeah. Oh golly. Okay, so today we are talking about the Hobbit, chapter, what was it, 16? 16.
16. Thief in the Night.
Thief in the Night. Right. Thief in the Night. Yeah, exactly. And it comes right here between these other two chapters of the clouds gathering and then the clouds break. So chapter 15 was the gathering of the clouds, and that was with the two crows. And then chapter 16, we get this cataclysm of battle. Chapter 17, we get this cataclysm of battle. So you get the massive battle of 5 armies. And in between, you get this thief in the night, like sandwiched in between the two. And I don't know, maybe it's just me thinking about Tolkien crafting this business. I can think, here he is crafting this story, and he probably crafted the clouds gathering and the clouds burst, and then he thought, okay, wait a minute, I got to put something in between there. He plops this down in between. So it's not it's not exactly a filler chapter, because I think it does something about his character, about Bilbo's character. But it is interesting to me to kind of hear the gears of Tolkien working as he creates this thing in the first place. It is a pivotal chapter in terms of the character of Bilbo. I will say that much. And I would like to talk today a little bit about the character of Bilbo, but also about the Arkenstone itself. What is that jewel?
Yes.
In some, Bilbo basically, the dwarves are trapped there in the mountain, a standoff with the men and elves, and they will not budge or give up any of their gold. Bilbo decides, hey, enough of this. He sneaks out with the Arkenstone. He gives it to the elves as a way of bartering with them, and then he goes back to his camp, and that's essentially what the chapter is, if I got it right. So
yeah.
So let's see here. Let's start first with the nature of this jewel. What is this jewel that he gives, this Arkenstone? What do we know about that? Anything in particular?
Well, we know that it was fuzzy on the details of how it was delved out of the mountain, but in Thorin's grandfather's day, or perhaps great-grandfather's day, and then it was the crown jewel, essentially, of Thorin's grandfather and his father, Thror and Thrain.
Right.
And it is more precious than, well, other people's lives, anyway, to Thorin. He said he'd let stand against, or he'd give. It's without value, without what do you say, priceless. Right, it's absolutely priceless to him. This has him entirely intoxicated and willing to kill for it. He's essentially indicated that already ahead of time after Bilbo had found it, and maybe thought better of revealing the fact that he had it. But as we found out, the beginnings of a plan were hatching. And that's what leads him here. But the Arkanstone, what fascinates me most about it is the name of the thing. Right?
Yeah.
He didn't just call it the Jewel of Many Wonders, something like that, but Tolkien calls it the Arkenstone.
Yeah.
Arkenstone. I think that's fascinating to me.
Right. Because he could have called it an elvish name, like the Silmarils. That's a completely created name, right? Arkenstone, that's not, first off, it's not an elvish word. And why would he call it that particularly, Arkenstone?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be a stone that, if I gather, it's roughly the size of a football, that big. American football, sorry. Not soccer ball, football.
Right.
And almost like ovoid shaped, from what I gather from various drawings and discussions of it. And it is something which I think they describe it at one point that, like the Silmarils, it captures the stars and the moonlight in it. So it's almost like when you look in it, you're looking at moonlight and starlight in the stone itself. There's a magical property almost to the stone that it has this it's not just glass. It really glimmers inside it. And this stone is called that because in some ways it's the heart of the mountain itself. It's the heart of the mountain, and the heart, therefore, of Thrain and of Thror and of Thorin. So in a way, Bilbo steals Thorin's heart and takes it to the elves in a way,
Yeah, to redeem Thorin and everybody else who's otherwise trapped in the mountain.
Yeah, to redeem him. So he has taken the heart of this dwarf who has obviously been infected by the dragon horde very quickly, and he's using this generosity, this false generosity, to try and save him. It's interesting. He does make a legal claim to it, and there's nothing that prevents him from making that legal claim. Right? I mean, doesn't he say at one point that Thorin had promised him a certain share in the treasure? And he says, you weren't specific. And so he takes the Arkan.
Yeah, that's exactly, and he says that in this very chapter, if I'm not mistaken, he says, I'm willing to let this stand against all my claim.
Yes.
And which shows that Bilbo has the opposite state. He's got the opposite character trait that Thorin is exhibiting right now. Thorin is grasping and sitting on even that which is not his by right.
Right.
And Bilbo has taken something that, by legal technicality, he would have the right to lay claim to, because he can pick his own 14th share. Well, that's what he's done. And it's only later that Thorin, said no for Bowden on the Arkenstone. I reserve that for myself. But Bilbo had already laid claim to it already at that point. But Bilbo is saying he's willing to give that all up just to have this whole messy affair, terribly uncomfortable thing over with. Just to buy peace, to broker peace. He's willing to get rid of all this stuff. What is it? It doesn't matter to him. This is nothing to him.
Yeah. And on the one hand, let's take the negative side of this. Is he just sort of like a crunchy hippie trying to prevent war, sticking flowers in the muzzles of guns or something? Because I suppose you could read it like, oh, he wants to gloss over all this nasty business, this unpleasantness, and stop warfare with love. I suppose you could say that. But I don't know if that's entirely given credit.
I don't think so. I mean, in part, it's very much part of Bilbo's temperament, who comes across, at least in his Baggins part half, as a rather phlegmatic individual, temperament-wise. His sort of biopsychological kind of makeup, right? His temperament, his raw sort of physiological tendencies, tends to dislike conflict, right? He dislikes conflict when it can be avoided, and likes things in a nice, clear business way. Let's just do what makes sense, very pragmatic. And in that way, you can see, obviously, this is war. This is tending towards war, and it's all very stupid that this is happening. So it's unjust. There's no reason to go to war here, except that Thorin's got a bad attitude right now, essentially, right? But I think there's something deeper to it too. I mean, you've got, and especially with the title of the chapter, right? If we look at not merely at first glance, like a cursory reading of what is Bilbo doing, but the fact that it's titled A Thief in the Night, and it's situated right between the gathering of the clouds and the clouds burst, which is, of course, the battle of the five armies, is that you've got this explicit allusion to in the sacred scriptures, where they talk about, the middle of one of the parables in the Gospels, Christ talks about the bridegroom coming in the middle of the night, or the Lord will come upon you like a thief in the night. And so we have the thief in the night coming out in the middle, in the middle of the night. And he comes and he brings this thing over to the other camp, essentially to the remembering that at least the men of this, men-elves alliance are essentially refugees. He brings this over to them and says, you guys, you might find this helpful in bargaining with Thorin. But he's still very much friends of Thorin and company. He goes back, if he were just a peace hippie, he'd be out there, he'd give him the gem, and then he'd go, lay out in the sunshine and dance in the forest and play in the fields or whatever. No, he goes back because he knows where his duty is, where his own heart is still faithful to his fellows. He just says, here, this will help set things right, essentially. Hopefully we can overcome this mess. But he's really redeeming Thorin. He's redeeming himself and Thorin and all that are in there. He's trying to buy the lives of everybody involved who would otherwise die in this senseless conflict between friends, between allies, between brothers. And that way there's something much, much richer going on.
Yeah, it's a far more profound way of looking at it, I think, because on the one hand, he is concerned, and we saw this at the very beginning. He's concerned with justice to some degree or another. He's always concerned with the rectificatory justice and setting things right, restoring order. I mean, from the very beginning, we saw that he was somebody who was overly concerned with balance and order. He doesn't like things out of place, and the dwarves messing up his house and chip the glasses, crack the plates. He didn't like that at all. And so here, there's a sudden echo of that happening here, where he wants to put all the plates back together where they're supposed to be, not have them thrown off the shelves. But more than that is that he has made, I think, a friendship or affection or connection to these dwarves, which in some ways becomes the salvation of the dwarves. Right. The dwarves and elves and men ought to be allies, especially allies against the dark forces, the orcs and the Sauron eventually. So there, as you said, there's no reason for them to be fighting. This is a foolish fight to be having. But the dwarves, in their natural state, would not be friends with men and elves because of their natural greediness. They're clinging to gold and jewels. So here's Bilbo, who, because he has made the friendship with the dwarves, becomes a sort of intermediary between them and is able to reconcile them in the way that they ought to be reconciled. And that's why also, in a way, he's the salvation of the dwarves, the salvation of Thorin. I don't want to say he's a Jesus figure. He's not a Jesus figure. I hate that whole like looking for Jesus figures in artwork, you know. Right. But he is taking his share, taking his entire wealth that he has gained from this whole venture, and using that to save the relationship between the dwarves and elves and men, but also save the lives of the dwarves and elves and men. So he really is kind of a savior in this sense, or attempting to be a savior in this sense.
Yeah, at least a redeemer, in that he's literally redemptor, to empere, to purchase, right? He's literally trying to buy back peace.
Yeah.
He's trying to redeem the peace. Even and it's because it's not just the jewel. It's, you know, when they show up with the jewel, he knows, and the Elf King indicates to him as well, that it's going to be obvious what's happened once we show up with this thing to bargain. You know, your life is in grave danger, Mr. Baggins. You know, perhaps I know something more of dwarves than you do, says the Elf King. And so Bilbo's conscious, especially somebody who thinks these things out very in meticulous detail. He's conscientious of the fact that, or he's aware, I should say, he's aware of the fact that this comes at great risk to himself. At best, this would be to sacrifice his relationship with Thorin. At worst, Thorin may slay him on the spot.
Yeah, right.
But he's still willing to go through with this.
Yeah, so this is not a simple barter and trade thing. This is actually a very dangerous venture that he's entering into when he chooses to do this. It also involves treachery, and he even says at one point that I feel badly about tricking. Who was it? That was it? Balin.
Yeah.
Yeah, he feels badly about it, right? Because he knows he's tricking the guy. The guy's going to get in trouble for it. So there are elements of real danger in doing what he's doing, sneaking out of the camp and taking the Arkenstone and all this. And yet he sees it as absolutely necessary, and I think rightly so. This does indicate a change in him as well. You know, we've been talking before about how this whole story is the character arc of Bilbo, of the protagonist. Really a character arc towards becoming a full human, becoming fully alive, and no longer just this sort of bourgeois trapped in your mother's basement type character. Right. And I think this really speaks to this. Although we talked about how when he struggled with the dragon back in Inside Information, he struggled with the dragon in the hallway, and he overcame it. And nothing after that was anything compared to this. But I think this is pretty significant. This indicates, so this is the outcropping of that struggle with the dragon down there in the tunnels. Mm-hmm. He wrestled back there in Smaug's cavern. He wrestled with his own tendency to be a dragon, and his own fear of becoming a dragon, and his own fear of being devoured by a dragon. And here he's acting based not on fear, but on love for the dwarves and the elves and the men. Right. But I think there is an element of this sort of like, if I did it, you know, he could have taken the Arkenstone and then fled. You know, he had to go to the camp, because going to the camp was an added thing. So sneaking out was one, stealing Arkenstone was one thing, sneaking out was another thing. Going into the camp of the elves and men, which was dangerous too because they almost shot him in the river, was another thing. But he could have fled into the wilderness in the same way as another figure has done before, right? The master of the town. He could have done it. And yet he doesn't. He doesn't. He goes through with this whole plan he has come up with. And what does that indicate about him as a character, I think? It indicates something very significant about his growth as a human being, we'll say, not as a hobbit anymore, but as a human being, his growth as a human being. Yeah. Among the many things that it indicates, I think one is that he values human life, or life. He values life more than treasure. That's pretty obvious at this point. And that's a flip from where Thorin is right now, who values treasure more than life. We could say
Yeah.
in some ways, he values life more than he values a cause too.
That's true.
This is for a lot of us who philosophize. It's easy enough to say, I value life more than I value material possessions, because most of us philosophers never get material possessions anyway, because of course church might. But for us and for many people, what we don't recognize is another form of treasure is a cause, an idea, an ideal. And are we willing to kill or allow others to be killed for the sake of an idea? That's a much more difficult question to ask, I think, than are we willing to kill over a color TV?
Right.
I think in this case, Bilbo realizes that the cause, which was to get back the gold or to kill Smaug or whatever it is, was less important than the lives of the people that he had come to admire. That's a big deal. How many people even now can put down their causes, right, and say, you know what, I disagree with you, but I still value you as a person, and we can talk about this. That's a tough thing.
Right. That's very different. Yeah.
What other things does this indicate about him? I think it also indicates, for instance, he is no longer self-centered. So we talked about how he originally was self-centered, right?
Right, because that peace, that balance, that harmony was to keep his own comfortable bourgeois life.
Yeah.
This goes beyond his own comfort, because as you've identified, he's put himself in mortal danger on a number of steps that he's taken in this undertaking of being a thief in the night.
Yeah, and that is another big deal here, to shift his focus away from Bilbo-centric to other people being important, because I think that the tendency to be self-centered is a tendency that leads very quickly to that dragonish nature that has been sort of the theme of the work. That you want to nestle down into your own gold and ignore everybody else, or even destroy anybody else who gets near your own gold. And at the beginning, we saw Bilbo's tendency. We don't like adventures here. Thank you. Good day. Come to tea on my term. And even though it was on a smaller scale, it was very much this sort of I'm the most important thing. And now he's shifted to see something else is more important than I am, and that's a pretty big shift, I think.
It is, and it just occurred to me that another aspect of this development for Bilbo and for the story itself is that it's here, really, not a few chapters ago when he went down and stole the cup from Smaug, that he fulfills that for which he came. He fulfills what Gandalf prophesied of him was burglar. If I say he's a burglar, then a burglar he is, or will be when the time comes.
Yeah.
It's now he's the true thief in the night. He's able to fulfill his real mission or vocation, whatever we want to call it, in being the burglar or the thief, not by stealing the goblet from the dragon, though that is a part of it. It's at a lower level of reality, sort of the lower ontological level here of his thiefness, of his burglary. But rather at the higher level, the fulfillment of his role as thief and burglar is not merely to claim treasure, long lost, ancestral treasure for the dwarves, but to reclaim the dwarf for the dwarf, to reclaim Thorin by means of to reclaim Thorin's real heart by this heart of stone. It's not merely referred to as a jewel, but it's the Arkenstone. It's the heart of Thorin. Thorin's heart then is a heart of stone. So he's going to take this and he's going to redeem Thorin with it, to buy Thorin back with it by stealing this. That's his real role as a thief. This is that for which every other thievery that he's engaged in so far has led up to, has been preparing and training him for. Yes.
Yeah, maybe it's because I'm just tired, but I suddenly had the Neil Young song "Heart of Gold" come into my head. Or a heart of gold. We use that phrase "heart of gold" instead of heart of stone or heart of ice, and even that phrase of the heart as being sort of the seat of our passion or desire or emotions or self even. That's an interesting. And the heart of stone that threatens Thorin, I think, once threatened Bilbo, but by the fact that he is giving up his own share, his own life, in order to save them, he has changed himself into having a human heart. You know, as Christ says, I want to give you hearts of flesh instead of hearts of stone. Does it not strike you as odd, too, how many references in the scriptures there are to Christ or the Lord being like a thief or like an assaulting arm, or things that otherwise you would think rather negative connotations? Why does that happen so often in Scripture? I remember Fulton Sheen once talking about the Scripture passage that says, "The gates of hell will not prevail against the kingdom of heaven." And he points out that our normal understanding is that that hell is attacking heaven, but they won't succeed. That's how we normally see it. But he says that's not what it's saying. It's actually saying that the gates of hell are a fortress. They're the city of Dis. Dante creates it. They're a fortress. And the attacking army, the besieging army, is actually the Lord, is actually God.
Right.
He's doing the attack, undermining, and the subterfuge and the espionage. He's doing all that.
That's
Why?
exactly right. Because when was the last time you saw a gate take the offensive on something? I mean, if the gates of hell won't prevail against it, they're the things that are being assaulted. Yeah.
And as Fulton Sheen points out, the world itself is already in captivity. We are already in captivity. We are held captive by the powers of darkness. Even though the world's a beautiful place, we're held captive by the powers of darkness. And if we were not assailed, if we were not assaulted, we would remain in that darkness without even knowing it, and just descend further and further into despair and sorrow and darkness and attachment to this world, thinking somehow the things of this world are going to fix everything. There's that great poem, "Batter My Heart, Three-Person God," right?
Yeah.
John Donne, I think. Let me extend my brain really quick
to check that.
Yeah, I think that poem, classic example of that, of exactly this. Holy Sonnet 14. Yeah, and this is by John Donne. If you don't mind indulging me in my poetic bent for just. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet, but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town to another, do labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason your viceroy in me should defend, but is captived, and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. That's a great poem, and it's kind of extreme. He's going to extreme here, and he does that frequently in his poems, Donne does. But it's like he's saying, I am the captive bride of this awful force, and all your whispering and cajoling and shining on me, that's not going to work. What has to work is something coming, taking me. As he even says, unless you ravish me. We could use the other word rape here, strangely enough. Unless you rape me, I will never be chaste. You have to break this hold that the world has on my soul or on my mind in order that I actually be free. And there are numerous poems in Anglo-Saxon about the bride that's taken by somebody, and then the other family comes for revenge and liberates her and kills everybody and all this. So Tolkien, who would have been familiar with Donne and with the scriptures and with that, no doubt he's got an element here of this idea of the Lord coming like a thief in the night. I like that phraseology. Clause comes directly from this. That Bilbo has to act as though he were the thief who is stealing from this fortified place, literally fortified place of the dwarves. I mean, if he does not do it, the alternative is that the dwarves stay there and die on their gold. Bardas even says so. Stay there and chew on your gold until you starve to death.
Right.
And the dwarves came out and fought the men and elves. There would be great carnage on both sides, and then the goblins would sweep down, as we know in the next chapter, and they just take over. So it's kind of this important event that occurs in order that all these other things occur in the way that they ought to occur.
Yeah.
Another example of I would say.
Right.
Huh.
And when we take into account the greater or the larger legendarium, and we know the Silmarillion, the story of one of those Silmarils, the one that ultimately ends up in the keeping of Beren and Luthien, and to that matter, it ends up being on the Arendel's breast, where Elwing carries it out to the Arendelle, and they're set up into the stars. But their grandparents, or great grandparents, and this is the battle between dwarves and elves that was being referred to earlier in the story when we were introduced to the Elven King, is way, way, way back, like thousands of years before this, maybe 1,000 years. I'm fuzzy on the exact timeline of Middle Earth, but there was the Silmaril, one of the Silmarils, the Silmaril essentially that Beren and Luthien were able to recapture from the crown of Morgoth himself. He's going to be set in a necklace of some sort, and it's Thranduil. It's Thranduil. It's the same guy, but he's got a different name back then, and he's the king of Doriath, and his name escapes me right now. But do you remember what it is?
It'll come to you when you don't need it. And
exactly right. But in any case, so there's this gem, one of the Silmarils, these semi-divine jewels, and that is going to be set into jewelry, but you have the elves contract the dwarves essentially nearby to craft this together, because their craft at making jewelry that surpasses anybody else, and they do this essentially, but then they want to keep it, right? They become enthralled by the gem, and then they go to war, and they actually, when it's taken from them by the elves, so it's rightly theirs, and they pay them for it, then the dwarves, those dwarves came down and raided, and they absolutely slaughtered almost to the last man, with one, child escaping with a few refugees, with a child who ends up being the parent or grandparent of Arendelle, ends up fleeing and having the jewel. But otherwise, it's just mass carnage, and the King of Doriath is entirely laid waste because of this. It's not kinslaying, I suppose, because it's dwarves fighting elves together. But that's what we're facing here with this same thing, is an echo of that. So that this idea that over this gem, so just as and we can think following the same kind of extremes that you just cited from Dunn, just as in the past, a primal gem, which is what an Arkenstone is, and we'll get into that particular term yet. I want to circle back to that. But back then, the gem was the cause of, or was the precipitating thing for this massive slaughter. So now, the thievery and redemption using this gem can be used to avert massive slaughter between elves and men on the one hand, and dwarves on the other. Essentially over the same cause, over the same problem. And so now we can reverse what had been done before. But that Bilbo's fear is very well founded, because this same thing is following that pattern, that it could go terribly, terribly wrong should the elves and the dwarves fight one another.
Sure. That's really interesting. And I had forgotten that story, so thank you for reminding me of that. If that's the case, and I don't know whether Tolkien had all this in his head when he was creating The Hobbit or not, or whether it was just intuitively this is what the protagonist needs to do. But if that's the case, it's fascinating, because there's an old medieval trope where the Christ is the new Adam, and he reverses what Adam did that caused man to fall originally. And because Christ is the new Adam, Mary was frequently in medieval art as the new Eve. And they would have these images on a triptych of Eve on one side and Mary on the other. And Eve had a banner that would come out that would say Ava. And then Mary would have a banner coming out that would say Ave. You know, the word gets flipped. And they're like chiasma in Greek, chiasma in Greek. There's two bookends that border the story of humanity, so to speak. In a way, it's kind of like that, because the connection to the Silmarils definitely has a connection to this kinslaughter and destruction and bad blood between everybody. Here, it's the opposite. It's redemption. It's the bringing them together. And as it says later in the text, the men, the elves and dwarves solidify a friendship that lasts for many years to come, and in long range allows them to defend against the forces of darkness during the War of the Ring in the Lord of the Rings. Remember that Erebor gets besieged during that time, and the siege is actually lifted by elves in the Lord of the Rings story. We don't see that directly in the text, but it's referred to. That would not have been happened had this reconciliation not occurred. So you get a reversal here of what originally occurred in Silmarillion, just like the reversal of Eve by Mary, Ave, or Adam reversing to Christ. That's an interesting take on it. And the pivotal thing, the two pivotal things are, on the one hand, the Arkenstone, because it connects to the Silmarils, and on the other hand is the character of Bilbo, who plays a great role in the story. That seems to me why. That seems to me why the Elf King then says to him something to the effect of, "You're like an elvish prince. You know, you have," what is the line? He says, "You are more worthy to wear the armor of elf princes than many that have looked more comely in it." And he names an elf after that.
Yeah, that's no small praise there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
He brought in the fold of elves, so to speak, and made an honorary elf.
Yeah, the immortal ones, those of the other world, these next to the gods, I mean, he's raised to that level. And that's why I think that there's just more to the Arkenstone itself that's left unsaid in the text. But because of these echoes, I've always believed, or wanted to believe, that the Arkenstone is, if not a Silmaril, one of the Silmarils, a sort of geologic child of the Silmaril. Because taking from the first, there's the replication or the echoes across millennia of what has happened before in the same conflict, taking that as a starting point, and the power that this Arkenstone has, it has its own interior light, we're told. Yeah. Right? It shines with the light from within it. It doesn't merely reflect. It shone with its own inner light. And he names it the so Tolkien names it the Arkenstone. That is to say, the first stones, the principal stone. This is what archin means in Greek. It is, archi is the word that is both, it means both the first thing, like the principal, well, it's like the word principle in English. Right. It can mean both chronologically the first in line, but also the most fundamental thing, the first principles. And in that way, and it's also where we get the word architecture, hierarchy, and these kinds of things. This framework structure that underlies everything. And that's why I'm convinced it's not merely the heart of the mountain, but it's something much, much deeper and older, in a similar way to Tom Bombadil, Yarwin Ben Adar, the oldest and fatherless, who's somebody much, much older and of greater significance than we're ever given a glimpse into. But the Arkenstone then is somehow this first of stones, or this most important of stones. And what I see as a plausible etiology of the Arkenstone is that back in the days of the Silmarillion, the sons of Fëanor, it essentially comes down to two remaining stones. If the stone gets onto Yarandil's, they take the necklace, from Beren and Luthien, pass it on to their child, who passes on to their child, who is Arundel, puts it, gets on his brow, and then he goes off, he sails, and he and Elwing are set in the stars, right? Right. And then these other two, one is thrown, and the Sons of Faerie eventually just, they're done with this. This just, it's been nothing but hell for them ever since the kinslaying, and they fled the Undying Lands and all of that. So they take these, and they, after all this tragedy, one flings it into the final one flings it into the sea. But before that, one of the other elves, one of these other sons, Noldor, takes the gem and either casts it down into a crevice, down into some crevasse opens up in the earth, and I think he might fall into it holding the Silmaril, something like that. In any case, the Silmaril itself goes down into the fiery belly of the earth. And my hypothesis is that is enough, if not merely that the Silmaril pops up under the Lonely Mountain after, however long of geologic time, to be discovered by the dwarves in later days. If not that, at least somehow the Silmaril perhaps melts down in the heat of the subterranean lava, and somehow crystallizes, or some alloyed, diluted, albeit alloyed and diluted element of it recrystallizes at the base of the Lonely Mountain, that later then gets carved out, mined out, and discovered by the dwarves. That's why it has this power. Not that Tolkien necessarily planning that through, but if you were to look at all that exists in Tolkien's world that he's created, this is, to my mind, a plausible lineage for where the Arkenstone actually comes from. That somehow it's the offspring of that Silmaril that went into the heart of the earth.
Yeah, why not? Let me really quickly, I just looked up what I can here, and if I can read just a couple passages to give some fodder to that idea. It says here, as you said, one of the Silmarils was recovered by Beren and Luthien. Oh, sorry, this is from TolkienGateway.net. One of the Silmarils was recovered by Beren and Luthien through great peril and loss, when Luthien sent Morgoth to sleep with her singing, and Beren cut it from his crown. The werewolf Karkaroth attacked them as they left Angband and swallowed Beren's hand containing the Silmaril, and this drove Karkaroth mad. He was later killed by Huan the Hound, who died from his wounds, and Mablung cut the Silmaril out. It was later taken to the Valar in the west by Erendil, son of Tuor and Idril, and husband of Elwing, heir of Beren and Luthien, as a token of repentance. So that one goes west. The Valar then set this Silmaril as a star in the sky. The other two gems remained in Morgoth's hands and were taken from him by a servant of Manwë at the end of the War of Wrath. However, soon afterwards, it was stolen by Feanor's two remaining sons, Methros and Maglor, as they tried to fulfill the oath they had sworn so many years before. But the jewels burned their hands in denial of their rights of possession, as they had burned Morgoth's hands before. In agony, Methros threw himself and his Silmaril into a fiery pit. Maglor threw his Silmaril into the sea. Thus the Silmarils remain in the ocean, the earth, and the sky. They're light present but inaccessible to those in Middle-earth. So that's interesting because, it's not only is it the three major elements, right, of the four elements, but that the casting into the fiery pit, where was that pit? That'd be interesting to find out. And also the sea business, being thrown into the sea, there was that whole cataclysm that occurred when the Númenóreans rebelled and the whole receded. So
much of the Earth's geography has changed since this happened.
So it could be that it's that technically that there could be a line traced from the Silmaril to this Arkenstone. There could be a direct connection. It says in another, that was Tolkien Gateway. This is the Tolkien Forum. There are lots of Tolkien websites. It says here, even though the word Arken cannot be found in the modern English language, the name Arkenstone can loosely be translated to precious stone. Another interesting theory that is linked to the etymology of the word Arkenstone is its etymological connection between Arkenstone and Silmarils. See? According to an old English version of Valinor, the Silmarils were called Erklanstanas, which also means a precious stone. Fans speculate that Arkanstone was the source of the word Arkenstone, as the author is a Tolkien himself. The author of the speculation, I guess. Arkenstone is very similar to Silmarils in its name and spirit. It is also widely believed that out of 3 Silmarils, Arkenstone most likely seems to be the one that was taken by Mithras, because it gets described as taken into the bosom of the earth when he casts himself into a gaping chasm filled with flames. So that's intriguing. That's intriguing. Here's a third one, a third entry. This is from also from Tolkien Gateway. Arkenstone means roughly precious stone. Arken does not exist in modern English. It's a modernization of an ancient word which appears in the Edda. I always go with the Edda.
I always go with the Edda when in doubt.
Edda, you know, that's probably the most likely source. Yarknestein in the Edda. In Old English, Arkanstone, but Yarknestein. Boy, that sounds very familiar, does it? Yarknestein. Arkenstone, Yarknestein. Tolkien used the word Arkanstone to refer to the Silmarils in Old English texts by Elfine. And they, some fans explore that possibility that it was one of the Silmarils, not just descended from it, but actually was the Silmaril that Mithras tried to get rid of by throwing it into a chasm. Now, that would be kind of exciting to find out. If this was the Silmarillion, then really you're getting in The Hobbit a connection not only to very ancient lore, but you're getting that story continuing into the modern era, because of course Bilbo is the reason why the ring comes back onto the scene, right?
Right.
That's an interesting link.
Hold on. So that means if that's a Silmaril at this moment in Thief in the Night, and previous ones, but highlighted here, you've got Bilbo holding the one ring of power made by Sauron, through which he subjugated all the known world of in Middle Earth, and the Silmaril, both in one thing.
Yeah, I know. It gives you chills. Wow. Oh. And what's more is he gives up both of them.
Yes.
For a minute too, because not only is he holding both of them, but then he freely gives them up. First the Arkenstone, and then later the ring, although with much struggle with the ring. But he gives them both up. I mean, well, I can't even imagine what that would be like for us in the modern era. That'd be kind of like, I don't know, looking at a piece of the True Cross, for instance, maybe. Okay, you get a piece of the True Cross, like what Saint Helena gained, and you're holding, you have it, you got it. I don't know, you went to Constantinople, you picked it up. I don't know, but you have it now. And then you also have what else? A major artifact from the ancient world, right? There's only one of them, like the jewel encrusted Bible of Constantine. Okay,
right?
Something like you've got both. And then you freely give them up. Don't even ask any money for them. You're like, here, National Museum of Art, here's the jewel-encrusted Bible. Wow. That's some powerful craft going on right there. I mean, I don't know whether, and I don't know if Tolkien thought all this through at the time he was writing The Hobbit, because the elements of the Arkenstone are similar to the elements of the Silmaril, but which came first? Which did he develop first? Did he develop them at the same time? I don't know. It is interesting, if you take it just on its face value, that Tolkien is always dealing in images of light and darkness. And for him, this image of a jewel that could somehow capture that beauty of the stars in it. Not just if you live in Dallas, you live in downtown Minneapolis, and you look up, you see a few stars. We're not talking that. We're talking stars like out there in the Dakotas, right? Or standing out in the middle of Norway and looking up at the stars. That kind of stars. That's a whole nother ball of wax, so to speak, because you see, I was out when we were out there in Wyoming. I remember going out there to Wyoming, and one night walking out of the cabin where we were, and you look up, and you're looking at a sky that's purple. It's not black. It's purple with light. It's so many stars in it that you can't hardly imagine.
God, it's full of stars.
Yeah. It's full of stars. That's right. Another reference for the children there. But
don't touch the obelisk, man. Things happen.
Yeah, touch that obelisk. Just stay away from that. The stone is one that captures that beauty of the heavens in a ready-made package, a portable package. And you can carry around the beauty of the heavens with you in your pocket, so to speak.
The heavens in your pocket.
Heavens in your pocket. It's lovely. It's even better than having a cell phone. Maybe.
That's right.
And the beauty of that is also the curse of that, because the beauty of it is that you can look at the stars even in broad daylight. You can look at this thing and just, wow, it's gorgeous. And the curse of that is that you might not stop looking at that, like Thorin, that you end up looking at this beautiful thing that you have helped to craft, by the way, because they actually shaped the Arkenstone into that ovoid shape. You have helped to craft this beautiful thing, and you can't stop looking at it now. Like Galatea and Pygmalion, right? Or Narcissus in the lake. And if you can't stop looking at that beautiful thing, you're trapped. You're caught.
Yeah.
That's why I think even when he was doing the Palantirs, you know, the image of the Palantirs, I think he was thinking about something of that element there too, because the Palantirs, they're not as beautiful as the Silmarils. Obviously, they're more tool, more function, or technology.
Right.
But they have a similar quality in that you could stare into the Silmaril, into the Palantir. You could stare into that Palantir all day long and be fascinated by what you're seeing, engrossed, titillated, enthralled, horrified, all day long, and never look up at the actual stars or trees or humans. So as the Silmarils have this element of entrancing you in beauty and being just enthralled by beauty, and there's a risk there, there's a danger there. The Palantirs would have that, and you're enthralled by the technology. And you can't look away. You have CNN on 24/7. You know.
Yeah, that's what they are. And so that's interesting. And why is it that the Silmarils have that inner light, that beauty?
Yeah.
That beauty.
Yeah, it's almost like this.
Is it put in there?
In this article?
No, I know. I mean, it's just where did it come from? That's not just something that's, it's a nice trick of the gems or something like that. Like, that's actually the divine light of the Valar that was put into these two trees that Fëanor was able to somehow capture and place into these new jewels that he was making, these stones, the Silmarils. And so what we're seeing then if this hypothesis of the origin of the Arkenstone is correct, in the Arkenstone, you are beholding the primal light that existed before the sun and the moon at minimum.
That's a thought. It's almost like you're looking at the soul of God itself.
Yeah.
I got to admit, there have been some artifacts I have seen that strike me kind of like that. Like, they're so magnificent that it's hard to see them as just material objects anymore.
Yeah.
I'll just take one example. When I was a child, my father, who collected all sorts of crazy knickknacks, he had this carved piece of ivory, which I always heard was carved out of one piece of ivory. But it had it, and it was beautifully carved. It was Oriental Chinese, I think. And it had inside of the ornate carving, there was another sphere. Okay? So you had an outer sphere. It's about the size of a baseball. And inside there was another sphere that could rotate inside of the first sphere. And more than that is that inside of that sphere was another sphere. And there were 5 spheres, all total, inside of this one sphere. And it was carved out of one piece of ivory. And I swear, this thing, I would stare at this for hours as a kid, be like fascinated by this, because every single sphere was ornately carved. And it was absolutely beautiful. It was incredible. Like, how did anybody make this darn thing, And I don't know, maybe it was, now that I'm older and I'm more educated, I'm like, maybe it was just a mold. Who knows? I mean, maybe it wasn't made out of ivory at all. I don't know.
It's only a model.
But as a kid, it's only about that big. But it was really, as it was claimed, made out of one thing of ivory. It was so magnificent as to enthrall a person for hours just to look at this thing.
Yeah.
And I know I've seen certain artifacts in museums and like where I could just stare at that thing for hours.
Oh goodness.
So there is an element of the divine somehow captured in art, especially good art. Not Jackson Pollock so much, but in good art, there's an element of the divine which is exquisite.
Yeah.
And I think part of the nature of art, I've had that experience with certain musical pieces too. You know, you listen to that music, you're like, that's got it. That is the heart of the divine, the heart of the Valar. Yeah, and I think that in this instance, we've got something which is so powerful that Thorin himself is willing to throw himself in front of the bus, or anybody else in front of the bus for it.
Right. That's which speaks to
Life is, which right. Which by the way, you talked about how Bilbo has an inkling that this could get violent. At the very start of the chapter, there's no illusion that somehow this is going to go well. Because at the very start of the chapter, Thorin says, "For the Arkenstone of my father is worth more than a river of gold in itself, and to me it is beyond price. That stone of all the treasure I name unto myself, and I will be avenged on anyone who finds it and withholds it." So there's like no illusion here that this is going to turn sour really quickly. So Bilbo's like, I wonder if this is okay. Or
should I just give it to him now and it'll all be okay?
He did say I could take whatever I wanted.
Mi scusi.
Yeah.
It's not going to fly.
Piaci, I am so sorry. No, it's from the very start. Thorin is maniacal about this thing.
Yeah.
And it does speak to that element of the dwarves in general, but Thorin especially, that they're deeply connected to artwork and to material goods, especially beautiful material goods. Not so much the technology bit, but the material they're connected to is beautifully wrought and shaped. And they see things as calcified, stars calcified into a piece of artwork as being the thing to die for or kill for.
Yeah, right.
Which I suppose you could say is another example of their being saved at the end, because they end up, this may be getting ahead of ourselves, they end up joining the battle at some point, knocking down their own wall and joining the battle, not for the sake of the treasure, but for the sake of the fact that Bilbo and the others beginning to flag under this huge onslaught of orcs. And so they joined the battle for that reason.
Right. Which
is salvific. And we can talk next time the nature of the battle, why there's a battle and all this and some other things on that score. But I think this Thief in the Night chapter, even though it might have been inserted later when he was constructing the whole novel, is so pivotal to the development of Bilbo and the salvation of Thorin and the moving forward of the story and connecting back to ancient lore, that again, it's like this whole chapter in here you just throw away and just say it's not necessary in this story.
No, it's absolutely vital, because it is that linkage, like you said, it is that linkage to a much greater story, a much longer and older story. Like you said, the old lore that's not only echoed, but continuing in our present day, the present day of the Hobbit, in any case. And I did just quick look. It looks like Tolkien was working on the Silmarillion for a good close on quarter of a century before he wrote and published the Hobbit. And so this material about the Silmarils was already on his desk in scraps of paper in various places. It wasn't until later that he started to publish some of that stuff, or attempted to publish it. But these notes and these thoughts and early versions of the story were already written down. He had already been working on those prior to this. So I think it's very plausible that these things, there's an intentional connection between them. And as some of our fans may not be aware, Tolkien was writing this initial inspiration to kind of do a lot of the Silmarillion stuff, was to recreate. The whole idea about Middle Earth is that it's a projection back at a prehistory of our own Earth. This is Middle Earth, and some of his other projects were to try and make linkages between ancient Anglo-Saxon and Nordic mythology and this older lore from Middle Earth, the Silmarillion and all this. And he had a ill-fated attempt to, I mean, he never, insofar as he never completed it, to actually write a sort of a time travel series that would bridge that gap between Middle Earth and ancient Anglo-Saxon world history.
I did not know that at all. I did not know that. That's fascinating. There's so much that he was working on that, he had all his pokers in the fire, as any genius would, that end up being somewhat fulfilled or fulfilled later by Christopher or whatever, that it's this there's a treasure trove in and of itself, Tolkien's library. I do know that he was working on the Oxford Dictionary at this time, one of his major projects. A lot of people that love Tolkien don't realize that he was one of the progenitors of the Oxford Dictionary. He and a few others that were working on this. And so when we look at our dictionary, and that, but the Oxford, as far as I understand, the Oxford is the first major English dictionary that we have. So he was putting together all these words and the origins of words and the sources of words. So he was coming across words all the time that were linked to one another. And it was his work, actually, that was the seed for the development of the Indo-European migration theory, so far as I understand.
I wasn't aware of that.
As he and the others were working on this project of the Oxford Dictionary, they were noticing that words, the prevalent theory in the 19th century was that most of the English words came from Latin or Greek and some Germanic. And what they weren't thinking of very much was how all those words are so very similar to one another. It was when they started work on this Oxford project that they started to recognize that words in Germanic and in Italian and in Greek and in Middle Eastern were actually very similar to words even in Indian, the Sanskrit word. So they developed this idea that all these words emerged from the original Indo-European roots somewhere in the steppes of Asia, and that our Indo-European languages had these connections that then showed up long after the split between human beings had occurred. The what do you call it? The diaspora of the human beings. There's a great section on this in the History of the English Language podcast, where he talks about this whole business. And it was absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm very fascinated with prehistory, and Neolithic history and the like. And Tolkien was already seeing into that, and the emergence of this idea that the human race was a lot older than we thought, and there are a lot more connections than we thought, and that the culture goes way back. Here's a little blurb that I just came across here, which again, fascinating, right? This is the Wikipedia entry for Silmarillion. It says, the idea of the Silmarils is connected to Tolkien's exploration of the Old English word Sigilwara, which was used in the Old English Codex Unius to mean Ethiopian. So Sigilwara means Ethiopian.
Interesting.
Now, first off, why would the Old English have any connection to Ethiopia? That's right there fascinating. Because Ethiopia, right, Africa, is a long way from... Away. Yeah, right. So there must have been some interaction between those peoples, which flies in the face of the idea that these ancient people were located in one spot and didn't move around much. Tolkien wondered why the Anglo-Saxons should have had a word with this meaning, Sigilwara, and conjectured that it had once meant something else, which he explored in his essay, Sigilwara Land. He stated that Sigel meant both sun and jewel, the former as it was the name of the sun, rune, Sowilo, the latter from Latin sigillum, a seal. He decided that Hierawa was related to Old English hearth, and ultimately to Latin carbo, soot. He suggested this implied demons with red-hot eyes that emitted sparks and faces black as soot. The Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey states that this contributed to the sun jewel Silmarils, helped to naturalize the Balrog, a demon of fire, while the Ethiopians suggested to Tolkien the Haradrim, a dark southern race of men. So I guess you could say that etymologically he was working on all these words. He came across this word and he said, wow, how about these connections? Could this be the case? And developed all these different images that came up in his work, including the Silmarils, and probably including this Arkanstone to a certain degree.
Yeah.
That's fascinating stuff. Wow.
That is.
I'll
That
send
really
you all
is
this.
fascinating. That would be good. That's great. And I think it would be great because personally I wanted to do it, and I encourage others to do it because I'm excited about it, so other people should be too. Is to delve into Tolkien's what Tolkien actually did for a day job. He's a philology professor. He worked on that kind of stuff, and he wrote these books sort of in his abundant free time as one has as a penniless educator. But
Yeah.
as you do, and because what I think is underappreciated is how much for him this was one and the same project. So looking at the ancient prehistory of the origins of Anglo-Saxon Proto-Germanic languages is one and the same thing with writing this whole world of the Silmarils and even the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, is that is his foray into what people might nowadays call fantasy writing. What he
Yeah.
himself called fantasy writing was not merely a fun hobby. He's going to write some novels in a fantastic kind of way, but
Right.
rather, again, that is all within the bigger framework of hypothesizing
Yes.
the origin of a lot of our words.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so
Yes.
that's
Yes.
why the Silmarillion is something that is a projection back to say maybe that's where Sigalwara came from.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I
Came
get on
from
my
Silmaril.
If I can get on my
Yeah.
soapbox for a minute, I think that fantasy and science fiction have gotten such a bad rap from academia, especially because academics are all, hoity-toity sons of guns. That somehow fantasy and science fiction are lowbrow stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What I have come to realize, or came to realize, I suppose, when I was in my 30s, is that when we look at science fiction and fantasy, especially, we're looking at the frontiers of speculation. That's what these books are really like. Almost good fantasy and science fiction, not like fan fiction or that kind of crap. The good science fiction is pushing the boundaries of speculation. What could this word? What's the origin of this word? What's the origin of this culture? Could there have been this? Could we do this in the future? Might there be a Butlerian jihad against the machines at some point? Could we be living in a matrix? Is it possible to use words in order to change the shape of a thing or to cause fireballs to occur? No, those are all speculative forms of thought. And yes, it tells a good story because the story is important too. But whenever you're dealing with good science fiction and fantasy, you're really dealing with these frontiers of speculation that that's where the creativity of human life occurs. Right. Not in academic papers on the gender sensitivity of characters in Chaucer.
Right.
Who cares?
Yeah.
My father this is one thing, my father, who was a brilliant man and very well, graduated with his doctorate from Yale, for goodness sakes. He was a very intelligent guy. But he would sit for hours reading science fiction, Larry Niven and C.J. Cherryh and all these. Or he would sit sometimes he'd sit for hours reading Conan the Barbarian, I was loving the man that he him in his chair and his waistcoat basically and his full shoes on and everything, legs crossed, reading like a John Carter Warlord of Mars comic book, and you're like, man, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I think what you're suggesting here about Tolkien's delving into the origin of words is spot on. I mean, he himself said that every word has a history to it. And that's something I've come to realize in the last 20 years, is that every word that we use has this history packed onto it that we don't take the time to understand or to unravel, because you can't do that when you're using the words. But every word that we have is somehow connected to this vast history, which, if we don't know the history, wow, what a realm of speculation is there. Why would we say this and not that? Why would we use these words and not those words? And it's so, I don't know, it's rich too. I remember reading somewhere that someone did a study of the word yes in Europe, which, again, this is an academic who would do this, right? But he went around interviewing all the cultures to find out what they said for yes. And he found that in one region alone, in Italy, there were like 15 different words for yes, just in a few 100-mile radius.
Yeah.
So people, it was like this one word that we take for granted has so many variations. We, ya, da in Russian, ok, right? The lingua d'ok. That's why we call it. You know.
I've recently had a breakthrough realization about ok, because it's always struck me as weird, right? You've got see, we, see, you know, okay, it's surrounded by not ok sounds. Like, why did they say ok? Because it's such a weird thing. Because like, okay, well, that's weird, right? You know, why would you say? Why would that mean yes of all things? But then I listened to, and it was spurred by the local Orvietani here, with their what seems to be their attempt to pronounce what we presume to be English word okay, you know, because we also use the word okay to say yeah. We say yeah, okay, I'll do it. We mean yes when we say okay. But this is a harder sound for Italians to make. Italians typically say something like okay, you know, because they're trying to approximate the American sound. Well, locally here, it's similar to this verbal gesticulation, the sound that you make when you're saying yeah, you know, like yeah, I know, yeah, and so they say ok, you know, okay, you know. I mean, you think of some car dealer in Chicago saying like okay, you know, or some mobster in these old films.
Good
You realize that okay. That's the same thing. That's the same vocable that the Southern French do. There's an Occitanian. That's really not that weird because we use the same word all the time. We just pronounce it a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's a
but
good
it dawned
point.
on me that I don't know the origin of okay in English, but I wonder if it's not related, that it somehow comes from the same root, or at least the same inward sensibility, that somehow this is an affirmative kind of word.
Well, I mean, it's for a lot of people, this would be like a really ridiculous conversation, but that's okay.
That's okay.
That's okay. One of the things that we don't do, I don't know of any culture, for instance, that when they are trying to give the affirmative, they don't use like S. Okay, is there a culture that goes like for yes, right? Or is there a culture that goes? Right. I mean, maybe in Africa, it's like a clicking. You know, the African tribe that does the clicks when they speak. I forget which tribe it is. But is there an affirmative that goes? You know, I don't know. There's a limited amount of verbalizations you can actually do with the human mouth. But it seems pretty much unanimous that we use only a certain few for the affirmative. Yes, okay, ok, we. And so it does get limited after a while. And it's possible that whatever we use here in America in okay did emerge somehow from the same basic idea that the language ok actually emerged from. That is a possibility. I mean, I'm amazed, like in America, having lived in Texas and having lived in Minnesota and on the East Coast, the different words for yes that occur here even. You know, in Texas is yip, yip, not even yep, it's yip, yip, yip. Whereas here it's you betcha. Like you bet has nothing to do with you, but that's what people say. You bet. You betcha.
You bet. You betcha.
Yeah. Or sometimes they'll say yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
You know, the Finnish, German, Danish thing. It's startling to me when you start delving into these origins of words, how much history is really involved. Because when you say yeah up here, you are immediately tapping into the fact that this area was populated by Norwegians and Danes and Germans. Well, how? How did they get here? What brought them here? Did they come here even before 1492? I mean, there's the Kensington stone north of here, which is allegedly a Norse, you know, artifact from Norse travelers.
11th or 12th century.
Yeah, allegedly. I don't know if it's real or not, but why not? You know, and why not populate here and bring over their ya with them when they came? You know, this is good land. Yeah, good land. Yeah, good land. That's fascinating too. Absolutely fascinating. And I think to try and wrestle this conversation back to Tolkien, I think Tolkien would have sat there as he's making the Oxford Dictionary and suddenly come across a word and just be, you know, stuck. Why this word? Why would they say that word? Why would that word come here? It's a lot like I don't know if you know about this legend, which says that there are American Indian tribes on the east coast of America that are red-haired and blue-eyed. Okay.
Yes.
And they,
right.
in their language system, Celtic words, not just Celtic forms, but Celtic words in their language system. And what's even scarier about that is this tribe of red-haired, blue-eyed Indians with Celtic words in them were there when the Europeans arrived. Okay, now, what, huh?
Huh? it flies in the... Yeah.
Did St. Dan come over here on his little shelty boat and set up relations with the American Indians? That's quite amazing to me. To find a word like, a Celtic word suddenly in the midst of an American Indian language system would be startling. It's like finding a refrigerator in ancient Egypt or something.
Yeah.
Dang. That's not supposed to be there.
That's not supposed to be there. That goes against the whole, early modern West European idea that, this is first contact as of 1492, 1600s. But the world's been around for an awful long time, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it's not like people just discovered seafaring and ships in the 15th century. No. I mean, if they hadn't been doing it for a long time prior to that, that's fine. But we go back to when we were talking at the very beginning about weather patterns, is when you look at such a broader scope of history, you can appreciate that there's periods of advancement and high travel and high migration, and then periods of decline and very little travel.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that what immediately, we always make, there's got to be a technical term for this, but it's assuming what immediately preceded us is the way things have always been forever prior to now.
Right.
And that's like this fallacy of looking at history.
Right. We're all trapped in the education system that we were given, and we have to break out of that point in our lives. But most of my life, I was educated, as most people were, in the idea that we progressed from stupid to very advanced. And so the early people were stupid, and now we're very advanced because we have bicycles and microwaves and stuff.
That's right.
And
penicillin.
Really,
God bless it.
when you penicillin, which thank God for that, and modern dentistry. But when you start looking at some of these ancient patterns, it's really startling. I mean, this is why I like people like Graham Hancock, for instance, and others who talk about these ancient civilizations. My friend Ben Blackhawk he's put forth times the idea that the American Indians, the Native Americans, first off, were not Native Americans, and that they actually were a wave of people that came over not on the Bering Land Bridge, but that they came over by sea, because the populations in South America are far more advanced than the populations in North America, right?
Bingo.
That's a totally different model than the stupid to advanced progression, right? Because these would have been very that.
I mean, Thor Heyerdahl has a lot of, if you ever read like Kon-Tiki or the what's his other one? Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian fellow who then he built a reed boat in Africa or Arabia or something. They sailed it across the Atlantic to show that it could be done, because you've got this uncanny fact that in the Persian Gulf and on Lake Titicaca in Peru, up in the mountains, they use the exact same technique for making reed boats and the same kind of lifestyle, and all of that. And so, and this is where I think like reading Tolkien is helpful for that, because he said that the narrator says again and again throughout, and then you see it, of course, in the varying plot lines and histories, that the world is much older, much more complex, and there's been massive civilizations that have disappeared, and new ones have replaced them, and that there's not this continuous progression, but there's a constant flux, like the waves of the sea. And Tolkien writes that very beautifully.
Yeah, and certainly I've heard people talk about this in The Lord of the Rings, when you visit places like a Weathertop, and see the ruins of or whatever. But it shows up here too. The fact that you have the ancient areas that they go through in the Troll Shawls, for instance, or the connection to the elves culture. But even in this gem thing, if this is a Silmaril, and I really like that idea, if this is really a Silmaril, you've got this connection to a very, very old culture that Bilbo has in his hand. And that, yeah, that's powerful. I just found something too. Let me share with you really quickly. This is again from the Tolkien Gateway, but in the Legendarium it says Tolkien, the writing of the Hobbit, Tolkien halted after the capture of the dwarves by the Wood Elves and sketched out the continuation of the story in plot notes. Okay, in these notes, Bilbo stole a gem, which became a marvelous gem as he's writing the notes out, and finally the Gem of Girion. So in his original notes, he calls it the Gem of Girion. And he writes in the notes that the king of Dale gives the gem to the dwarves for the arming of his son. So Girion is actually the one who finds the gem and gives it to the dwarves, strangely enough. Which, right, reverse when Thorin won't give it up to the men. But if that's in the notes originally, how did Girion find this gem? Was he just like lying around or something? Was it that kind of gives fodder to the idea that this was a Silmaril, because
Girion has the. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just they were tough. They're not easily broken, damaged, and so this Silmaril, if it was cast into the earth, into the fires of the earth, might not have been melted down. Might have over a long period of time come back to the surface somehow and been found by Girion and given to the dwarves.
Yeah, and in some ways could be Girion's by, I want to say by right in some sort of way, or there's a fittingness to that because Girion understands the speech of birds, right? The men of Dale, especially the kings of Dale, understand the speech of birds, which means they are somehow connected to Elvish blood, Númenorian blood at some point. The kings of Númenor, who of course were descended from, descended from Beren and Luthien, descended from the union of elves and men. They're half elvish, descended from the half elven. And so you could say that somehow the Lords of Dale are not, and it's true, the Lords of Dale are not like the men of the Lake. They're of a different race, right? The men of Lake Town, and thus like other men, but they're more akin to the Númenorians. They share some common blood in that way, even though it's not, to my knowledge, spelled out explicitly anywhere. But that would in that way that would be fitting that Girion found it, right? And of course, if we step back and understand the frame of The Hobbit, is that it's a account of something that was The Hobbit was written by Bilbo, the character in the story, and so the only things that are in there are not necessarily always historical fact, but they're fact as they're based on the evidence that Bilbo had presented to him as a author. Bilbo the author is writing these things as the dwarves would have told it to him, as they would have understood. So he's got a received tradition of the origin of the Arkenstone that maybe Tolkien had in mind originally, and maybe even more, because Tolkien's the omniscient creator of the whole world, knows that the Arkenstone actually got into their hands in some different way or something, even though Bilbo, from Bilbo's perspective, he wrote what he knew, which his received tradition versus the original tradition of the origin of the stone, which is really fascinating. I love those layers.
I love that meta interpretation. You have Tolkien, who's the actual author of the author Bilbo, who is authoring the character Bilbo, who's telling the story that he received from another authored character. It's almost like that artifact I was talking about, of the piece of ivory with the pieces inside of it that around.
And you can look at like the Lord of the premise for the Lord of the Rings is that this is the Red Book, which was somehow retrieved from an archaeological dig that uncovered old Hobbiton. And it's something that was, redacted by many hands. It was originally written in some other tongue, which Tolkien then took the liberty of translating into modern English. And so he even gives somewhere in some notes there's available, you can find this stuff, like the real name of Meriadoc Brandybuck. That's the anglicization of this really complex, weird Welsh-sounding name, which was in the original manuscript tradition. It's this, but in modern English it's rendered as Meriadoc Brandybuck or something along those lines. Like he's got this whole, and the guy wasn't afraid to write books in even a contrived original tongue and then translate it into English. I mean, he did this with Beowulf. So he translated Beowulf from Old English, and then he wanted to project back what's the origin of the story of Beowulf. what's a simpler folk story version of it. And he went ahead and he wrote that, but he wrote it in Old English and then translated his own work into modern English rather than simply reconstructing it, because it had to be authentic.
That's, wow. I didn't know that. It's all like watching a Shaolin monk or something. Holy crap! Wow, that's really big. That's amazing.
I mean, when was the last time you sat down and wrote Old Gothic poetry? And I mean the language, not just black mascara.
Oh yeah, yesterday. Yeah, I just in my spare time, I figured, and I translated it basically into Swahili and translated it back. The frame of the story, then, the Bilbo recounting this story, he creates the frame because he's the narrator.
Yeah.
Just as Lord of the Rings, I guess you could say Frodo was more the narrator or the narrative voice. And the Silmarillion, if I understand it, was a narrative voice of an elf. There was an elf recounting this story. So it changes the whole color of the story. Because the Silmarillion, almost all the stories they're sad, sorrowful, so this longing for the past. But this story of Bilbo, if you take the character of Bilbo, well, his whole life would have been defined by the fact that he had not become a dragon. And so he's seeing elements as, this is how I was prevented from being a dragon. This is how I avoided being a dragon. This is how I was saved from being a dragon. And in that context, it would make perfect sense that this was the heart of Thorin, because he would have seen in Thorin something that he did not want to become. Namely, Thorin was closer to becoming a dragon than he was. And I think consequently, he would have recounted the story, not just as it was given to him, but as it also fit into what he was talking about, which was the salvation of his own life. And so it wasn't necessary to talk about Girion finding the thing originally or whatever. It fits far more with the idea of, as we've talked about, this character arc of the bourgeois dragon-like character at the beginning becoming fully human. Wow. As a last little tidbit here, when you're doing all this looking up of stuff in preparation for, I found two interesting things I'll just pass your way. One is, of course, these names of figures come up frequently, and sometimes in literature, when you use a literary term, it's just downright funny because you don't actually use it right. So, like, I remember seeing somewhere where they made a sport drink, a refreshing sports drink, and it was called Soylent, right?
Yeah. Don't do that.
Like, that's probably not a good name for your liquid vegetable drink there, because it could be something as Charlton Heston.
It could be people.
It could be people. There are two things that I found here. One is that there was something started in 1996. It was a growing of a gem called the Arkenstone, right? Okay. And that this company was based on this original growing of gem, and they grow gems and they refine gems. So there's a whole company called the Arkenstone Gem Company. It's a leading fine mineral and crystal dealer. It's located in Dallas, Texas. So there's that. So if you ever wanted like a gem, right, fine minerals or gems, you can go to the Arkenstone, irox.com, and get your Arkenstone there. So Tolkien fans, you can get an Arkenstone for your beloved and give it to her, right?
No need to lay siege to the mountain. You can get your own Arkenstone right here.
Order it online, for crying out loud, and get it to your army. Yeah. The other one is this is even more fascinating to me, is that there's an Arkenstone vintner, and they brew, or they vint fine wines. It is apparently the discovery. It says the discovery is in the 70s and 80s, and this guy Howell, what was it? It was on Howell Mountain, apparently Napa Valley, and they decided to create this vineyard, and so they produce fine wines. Ron and Susan Krause, they produce fine wines under the name Arkenstone Wines. So if you want to get an Arkenstone wine, stone.com, and you can get a fine Arkenstone wine there too. So I thought that was kind of fascinating. Without necessarily deep delve into the history of it, just knowing that that's a great image that Tolkien has created here of the Arkenstone. And salvation in a bottle.
That's right.
On that cheerful and bibulous note, I think we've done some yeoman's work here. I think this is good stuff.
That's right.
Well, I need to go and order my bottle of Arkenstone wine.
That's right.
Thank you, Cameron. It's been delightful again.
Thank you, Will.
Look forward to seeing what we have to say about this next bit, which is the war itself, the Battle of Five Armies, which comes next. Because although Thorin's soul has been bought at a great price, a pearl, right, of great price, he has yet to work out his own thing, and has to do so through this cataclysm of war, I think, in the next chapter, but we'll look at that next time. Okay, good. Thank you, Cameron. Farewell wherever you fare. To Ares receive you at your journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings vary where the sun sails and the moon walks.
God bless.
Wow.
Winds of wrath crown him with a living light. On the sun with burning brow, he turned his prow, and in the night, from the world beyond the sea, strong and near a storm arose, a wind of power in time and now, and past the seldom mortal goes. Find the far, storm the shadow. misty came, a distant flame before the sun. Wonder there the waking dawn, graveyard and what was right. And over hither he passed, and as the weeping sword of women and of urban maids, in elder days and years of yore, on him mighty doom was laid. The moon should fade, an orbit star, and pass that he never more on hither shores where mortals are. Whatever still a herald on, and that should never rest, if that his shining lamp afar, if flung he fed of western lands.